According to the internet, out in the middle of nowhere is a place that's very distant and isolated. Also, it's a place that's very remote, I guess. Also, quite far from the nearest town. Another definition is, in the middle of nowhere is somewhere in the countryside. Now, with all these definitions combined, how many times have you really been in the middle of nowhere? So without further ado, let's grab a blanket, turn off your lights, for true scary horror stories that happened, well, in those places.
My dad barely dodged a trap. This happened a few decades ago, but seems like a good short story for the subreddit. My dad was driving alone at night down a small country road with trees on both sides. As he's driving, he barely notices something kind of small hang up ahead. He slammed on the brakes and was able to slow down enough for the object to dink on the windshield. He freaked out and gunned it out of there. Someone had hung a heavy object from a tree branch so that it would smash the windshield of someone driving through and force them to pull over. At best, it was an irresponsible and dangerous prank, but it's likely that someone planned on robbing, killing, kidnapping. Taperecorder. My friends suggested I share my story here, and I finally have the time to type it out. I don't know if this exactly meets the standards of this outlet, but it definitely is the scariest experience I've ever had. Here goes. At the time, I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. Almost every house had acres and acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was very beautiful. As I now am 21 years old and living in a bustling city in Alberta, I do find myself missing the settling in my old backyard every once in a while, but it's usually accompanied by the unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in 4th grade, I was already trusted to be home by myself, as my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who literally lived a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child, and my father worked in another province months at a time, so I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late-night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night, exploring the forest. This night, I was exploring said woods. I usually never went too far in, usually up to a large rock formation I like to climb and look out through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. I felt like my own private place that I could enjoy. So, as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual spot, I started hearing a sound from further in. A sound that wasn't natural at all. Crying, faint crying. It sounded like a child, maybe even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared, since crying was the last thing I would expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced my ears were playing tricks on me, but it was in fact crying. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest and needed help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother for help, but then I worried that the girl would wander farther and beyond earshot. I decided to try to locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction the crying was in. It definitely wasn't easy as I thought, and it was a matter of trial and error to even make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realized as I was doing all of this was how consistent this crying was. No pauses, no words of any kind, just non-stop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was that the closer I got to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached a small clearing that had only a few small trees and bushes and nothing else. I'd never gone this far in before, so this was the first time I'd ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. A gray tape recorder, one of the biggest I'd ever seen, was peeking out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out from the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I had went all this way, expecting to find a real person, but there was only a tape recorder? As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady steps, advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying rocks and trees I identified as landmarks. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back, and I didn't try listening to see if that person was following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home, and nothing else. I had to get home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way, without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time, and immediately ran into my house, locking the door and shutting all the lights off as I went to my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would really be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked out through them as discreetly as I could to see if whoever had been out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed by that window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge out of the forest shadow, but nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mother about what happened that night, and I also never was able to go back in that forest ever again. Don't babysit in the woods. So my family and I were on vacation up the Poconos, which is a mountain area popular in the summer and winter time. The house we stayed in was in the middle of the woods, and one night, the adults decided to go out to a bar and put me in charge of babysitting. I was around 15 years old, and I was watching 3 kids under age 10. So the adults left, and me and the kids were playing Rock Band, when suddenly we heard a loud pound on the door. We all froze and looked at the door. We heard it again, so I panicked and quickly ran into the bathroom with my cousins and locked the door and said we needed to be quiet. I know it was an overreaction since I didn't even look outside, but I was 15 and in the middle of the woods. My cousins were scared and started crying, and I said everything was fine. It was probably just an animal at the door. I looked out the bathroom window and saw nothing, but heard footsteps walking around the front of the house. I heard another pound at the door and started to really panic. I tried calling my dad, but there was no signal. I called every adult that was out, and no signal. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. This only happens in movies. We waited in the bathroom for what seemed like forever, when I finally got the courage to get out of the bathroom and investigate. I quickly walked around until I made sure we were safe. Then I opened the front door and saw no one there. However, I did see scuff marks at the bottom of the door, which was odd. That meant someone must have been kicking at the door, which really freaked me out. I quickly locked the door, and we watched the movie until my family came home. I wish I would have seen who was outside, because I always wonder what was really going on. But it still freaks me out to this day, especially being in the middle of the woods. So, creepy mountain person, let's not meet like ever. The Woodman. First off, I want to apologize for my last post, as I am new here. Apparently, it was took down because of scroll boxes. I'm not even sure what that is. I'm not the best person at writing stories or formatting. Now, with that being said, I now like to move on and share another experience of mine. This story happened when I was around 10 years of age and involves 4 of my childhood friends. In case you didn't know, I am a 28-year-old female, and I am from a very country southern state. This was the most awful thing I've ever been through in my life. This story takes place back into the mountains. I was always so excited to see the weekend approaching, partly because I had a pretty cool mom who would take me places with my friends and pretty much let us have a little freedom. Other part is, I always get to spend weekends with my friends. So my friend Belinda asked if she could come spend the weekend with me. I asked my mom, who said yes. I waited until her mom dropped her off at the bottom of my hill and walked down to meet her. We walked excitedly back to my house. My mom then said her best friend Chris, who is female, called and asked if we wanted to come up to their mountain home for a visit. So my mom asked if Belinda and I wanted to go. We replied with a yes. Chris's kids are Alan and Jay, who happen to be 2 of my best friends. Belinda had a crush on Alan, and I was secretly in love with Jay. We left our house within 10 minutes and ascended to their home. As I said, they lived on top of a huge mountain that is very dense forest for miles beyond miles. So, after 20 minutes of driving, we finally made it to their home. My mom went in and was greeted by Chris. Belinda and I stayed out to talk to Alan and Jay, who also had a few other friends with them. We knew everyone there and talked with them. Scott being the oldest, Jay the second oldest, Ray, and then Alan being the youngest. They all kept going on and on about this cabin they had built far out into the woods. It was probably about 3 miles into the forest from their house. The boys wanted to take us down there to explore it. We agreed. I was used to roaming half of these woods, and I always loved venturing out into them. I grew up there my whole life. That all changed after this. We told them we had to ask my mom and use the bathroom before we could go. They sniggered, jumped onto their ATVs, screamed that they were going on ahead of us, and tell us to follow them when we're done. We go into the house, use the restroom, and ask my mom if we could go. We're in a hurry to catch up to the boys. She said yes, but for us to be careful. So we race out of the house. We start walking down their hill to descend to the main dirt road. We had walked approximately half of a mile to get to the road that led to the cabin. It was all mostly downhill, except for the flat main bottom road. We skipped merrily along, talking about the guys as we're going. They always liked playing pranks and jokes on me, since I was like their sister and grew up with them. So I told Belinda that I had a feeling they're going to jump out and scare us or something. Little did I know, I was in for a different surprise. We walked about another 2.5 miles to finally reach this cabin. It felt like it took forever, as this wasn't a road but a path. Sorry that I didn't elaborate more on the road, but this has been a very long time, and I don't remember it all on cue. When we finally reach it, no one was in sight. We walk onto the little porch and knock on the door, waiting for one of the guys to jump out and try to scare us. We step back and marvel at the little cabin. Jay really did a good job on it. He was always into building, creating, and growing things. We finally check the door and step into a little room. The cabin only had 2 rooms. It wasn't very big at all. No one appears to be inside or in the general area. All we can hear are sounds of wildlife. So we stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. It was then we heard the ATV a little ways above the cabin. Not back towards the main road, but further down the path. So we follow the sounds and finally see the guys. They're speeding off on down the path, stop long enough to yell for us to keep following them, and take off on down the path of the woods. We both groan very loudly. Belinda expresses concern, and just wants to go back the way we came to the house. It was probably around 3 in the evening, and she didn't want to be out in the woods anymore. I, on the other hand, was a little explorer. I wanted to keep going down the path, thinking somehow we could find the guys and possibly prank them. Boy, do I regret doing that now. In fact, I should have kicked their butts after this little escapade, but we take off farther down the path, after I talked Belinda into it. We walked for like 2 hours before we both realized that we are lost. We came to a fork in the road. There stood a tree with 2 arrows pointing to either side of the split in the road. I forgot to mention that it was summertime, and the daylight was long. It doesn't get dark here until around 8-ish in the summertime. We had walked for probably about 2 hours in total so far, and seriously, didn't know which side to go to. My friend started to panic a bit, and I tried to calm her down, assuring her that we had plenty of daylight ahead, and that we would make it back in plenty of time, although I wasn't so sure of that. We were about 7 miles into the woods that were endless at this time. I had no idea of our location, so we both decided to stick towards the right of the mountain. So we took off. Belinda was laughing and saying she was going to kick their butts later. I laughed that we made plans to get them back. We walked for what seemed like forever, and somehow ended up back to the split in the road. It was then growing a little darker, nearing dusk with every minute. Now this time, my friend and I were totally freaking out. She was sobbing and asking me, how are we going to find our way back out? I tried to stay calm and reassure her that we would make it back, but on the inside, I was just as scared as her. At that time, we stood frozen to the road, trying to figure out where to go next. That's when about 15 yards back, I heard a twig snap. I shushed Belinda and asked her, did she hear that? She started smiling and was about to call out for our guy friends. I stopped her suddenly, telling her to stay quiet for a minute. We continued to hear the footsteps. For some reason, I felt more terrified than I ever had in my life. I whispered for Belinda to start walking slowly down the left fork. The footsteps kept inching closer to our location. We tried to be as quiet as we could, but leaves were all under us. For some reason, I knew these footsteps did not belong to our friends. I had the awful feeling of dread, and my friends started to pick up on that, as the footsteps started sounding closer and faster. I decided to book it down this path, and my friend followed. I just felt I was running for my life, and that if I slowed down, I wasn't going to ever make it back, or go home again. We finally reached this embankment off the side of the path, so we decided to climb up it. I tore into the mountainside with my feet, my legs, and scratched myself along the way. We finally could see their barn up ahead of us, which was old and had not been used in a very long time. The footsteps still approached us after a short pause. My guess is they were quieter as they reached the mountain. Also, we had done descended into tall grassy fields, which made it easier to mask any sounds. As I finally realized our surroundings, I remembered their family graveyard was up ahead of the barn. It was very old, and had very old large headstones, as well as some crypts. I decided that was probably our best chance to hide, and get a view of who this person was chasing after us. So, we ran through the old iron gate, and hid behind the large tomb we could find. It grew very quiet as we stood frozen. My mind was racing. My body was shaking, and my heart was beating beyond control. Who was chasing us from the woods? What did they want from us? I had so many questions that may never get answered. Belinda and I sat there for what seemed like an eternity, but it was more around about 10 minutes. It gave us a chance to calm down, correct our breathing, and cool down from our run. We finally decided to stand up halfway, so that we could see if anyone was around us. We crept up to our feet, still crouching behind the grave. What we both saw literally made us pee our pants. There at the beginning of the cemetery stood a man. He was probably about 6 feet tall, appeared to weigh about 170 pounds, and was wearing dark clothing. His eyes looked very dark and wild. He stood there searching the graveyard with his eyes, trying to listen for us. We both immediately ducked back down behind the stone. We both started breathing heavily again. Scared to death, he had saw us raise up. Belinda shot me a look as the man started rustling around. I peered up again, and his gaze met mine. He then turned his body towards our hiding place, locked his gaze on me, and smiled a wicked smile. Then he said, "There you are." I didn't even hesitate. I screamed to Belinda. We both jumped up and started running toward the back of the cemetery fence. The man started chasing it behind us. Luckily for us, the cemetery had a very short fence, so we hurriedly hopped over and began to run in the direction of the house. We ran out of the clearing and reached the gravel road. We didn't slow down, stop, or look behind us. We just ran as fast as we could towards the house. The gravel lay beneath our feet. We made it part ways there, and at the bottom of the road, the boys all stood looking very worried. We ran up to them so fast that they jumped. I ran into Scott's arms crying, with Belinda right beside of me. She was crying too. Both of us looking a hot mess, bleeding from the earlier climb, sweaty, and our appearances very disheveled. We suddenly turned, remembering the reason for our panic, to see a man running back towards the graveyard. Scott, Jay, and Alan all screaming and chasing after him. We never saw him again. The boys chased him into the woods and couldn't catch up with him, so they came back and walked us up to the house. They all started crying, feeling very bad for trying to mess with us earlier. Our parents waiting on us scared to death. Jay and the boys admitted to leaving us and taking off into the woods, thinking it was funny and that we would find our way back. As it grew later, they all began to worry about us, and I went back through to search for us. When they could not find us, they went to all our parents and admitted what they did. They all went to search for us and started to panic when they couldn't find us. Chris was actually on the phone with 911 when we arrived, about to send search and rescue out for us. We had been gone for close to 5 hours. We told them the story and about the man who followed us. Police showed up to question us all and asked for the man's description. They searched through the woods and the mountain, but there wasn't a single trace of him. The boys got all grounded for playing their tricks. They honestly were all shook up about it though, thinking they'd never see us again, scared because it was getting dark and the man. They felt guilty thinking about him and thought it was all their fault. Needless to say, we forgave them. I never went back to that cabin or to that part of the woods again. So, creepy Woodman stalker, I honestly hope I never see you again.